The old man at the corner store of the rain fell lightly on the busy streets of Mountain View. Sundar Pichai had just finished a long day at the office. He was tired but felt calm as he walked to a small corner store near his home. He liked coming here because it reminded him of his childhood in India. The smell of fresh bread, the faint sound of music on the radio, and the simple shelves lined with food made him feel at peace. He opened the door and a little bell rang. Inside, the store was warm and quiet. There were only a few people. Sundar picked up some milk and bread. As he stood in line at the counter, he noticed something unusual. In front of him stood an elderly man. His clothes were wet and his hands shook as he placed a few items on the counter: a carton of eggs, a loaf of bread, and a small bag of rice. The man smiled weakly at the cashier and reached into his pocket. Sundar noticed that his pocket was torn, and a few coins slipped out and rolled onto the floor. The cashier waited patiently as the man counted his coins. But then the old man froze. His face went pale. He mumbled softly, "I'm sorry. I thought I had enough." His voice was thin and filled with shame. The cashier looked uncomfortable and said, "Sir, you're short by $3. The old man's eyes darted around the store. He seemed to shrink where he stood. Sundar felt something stir in his chest. He stepped closer, but before he could speak, the man whispered, I will put back the eggs." His hands trembled as he reached for the carton. Sundar watched him for a moment, thinking of his own father back in India. He thought of all the times his father had worked late and skipped meals so his family could eat. Sundar couldn't just stand there. He reached into his pocket and gently placed a $5 bill on the counter. The old man looked up, confused. I cannot take this," he said, his eyes wide. Sundar smiled softly and said, "Please, it's nothing, you keep the eggs." The cashier rang up the rest of the items. The old man stared at Sundar, his lips trembling. Then, suddenly, tears filled his eyes. He gripped Sundar's hand and whispered, "Thank you, son. May life be kind to you." For a moment, everything in the store felt quiet. Sundar felt a strange weight in his chest, part sadness, part something he couldn't name. As the old man gathered his bag and slowly walked out, Sundar noticed something strange. The man paused at the door and looked back. His eyes glimmered, almost as if he knew something Sundar didn't. Then he disappeared into the rainy night, but the story did not end there. When Sundar left the store, he saw the old man across the street, speaking urgently to someone in a dark coat. Sundar stopped and watched, feeling a chill in the air. The man handed the other person his grocery bag. Then the person in the dark coat nodded and slipped something into the old man's pocket. Sundar's curiosity grew. He stepped closer, trying not to be seen. But just as he crossed the street, a car honked loudly and blocked his view. When the car passed, the old man and the person in the dark coat were both gone. He stood there, confused, staring at the empty street. The rain fell harder now, and the grocery bag he carried felt heavier than before. He could not stop thinking about the old man's face, the sadness, the gratitude, and then that strange glimmer in his eyes. Little did Sundar know, this small moment in the corner store was only the beginning. Something bigger, something he could never have imagined, was already unfolding, and somewhere in the dark alley just around the corner, the old man was waiting for him. The alley of whispers, rain turned colder as Sundar stood there on the curb, his breath visible in the damp evening air. The streetlights flickered faintly above him, and the smell of wet asphalt and faint gasoline filled his nose. He clutched his grocery bag tighter, staring at the spot where the old man had vanished just moments before. His mind buzzed with questions he could not put into words. Why had the old man handed over his groceries? Who was the person in the dark coat? And most of all, why had his eyes seemed to hold a secret, something heavy, something urgent, just before he disappeared? For a long moment, Sundar just stood there, watching the shadows stretch into the alleys beyond. A strange pull, almost like a quiet voice calling him from somewhere unseen, urged him to move forward. It felt irrational. He was tired, it was late, and he had work waiting for him at home. Yet his feet began to move on their own, one after the other, toward the narrow alley where he had seen the two figures last. The street behind him grew quieter with each step until even the sound of cars felt far away. He turned the corner and found himself in a dim, narrow passage lined with faded bricks and scattered trash. A single flickering bulb above a rusted door buzzed faintly. Puddles of rainwater reflected the weak light in broken pieces, and somewhere deeper in the alley, he could hear soft murmuring, two voices, low but sharp, as if they didn't want to be heard. He paused and pressed his back to the cold wall, holding his breath as he inched forward. The words became clearer. It was the old man speaking now, his voice quivering yet determined. "He told me tonight would be the last time," the man said. His words were followed by silence, and then a deeper voice replied, calm but chilling. "Plans change. You don't get to choose when this ends. You know that?" Sundar's chest tightened. He peeked around the corner just far enough to see them. The old man stood with his back to him, clutching the grocery bag as if it were the only thing holding him upright. The figure in the dark coat loomed in front of him, tall and imposing, with a scarf pulled high over his face. In his gloved hands, the man held what looked like a small black envelope. Sundar couldn't see what was inside, but the way the old man flinched when he took it told him enough, whatever it was. It wasn't good. Sundar's first instinct was to step back, to leave quietly and forget he had seen anything. But then the old man spoke again, and something in his words made Sundar's heart drop. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "If I keep doing this, someone innocent will get hurt." The man in the coat leaned closer. "That's not your problem," he said, almost a whisper. Then he pressed the black envelope into the old man's hand and turned away, melting into the shadows at the far end of the alley until he was completely gone. The old man stood there for a long moment, shoulders slumped, staring at the envelope in his hands. Then, slowly, he slid it into his pocket and began walking back toward the street. Sundar panicked. If he didn't move now, he'd be caught standing there. But as he stepped backward, his foot slipped on a slick patch of water and sent a small can rolling across the concrete. The old man froze. His head turned just enough to catch Sundar's shadow against the wall. For a moment, neither of them moved, both of them suspended in that quiet tension. Then the old man spoke without turning all the way around. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice calm but heavy. "Go home." But Sundar didn't move. His pulse pounded in his ears. "What's going on?" he asked softly, surprising. Even himself with the question, who was that? "What did he give you?" The old man finally turned fully to face him. Even in the dim light, Sundar could see his eyes. Tired, haunted, but not angry. He sighed and took a slow step forward. "You're a kind man," he said quietly. "You helped me back at the store when you didn't have to. And because of that, I will tell you just one thing, then you must walk away." Sundar swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The old man looked him straight in the eye and continued, his voice barely louder than the rain. "There are people in this city, people who use others like pieces on a board. They make you choose between hurting yourself or hurting someone else. They make you believe you have no choice at all. I have done things for them, things I cannot take back. And this," he said, patting the pocket with the envelope, "is just another order." The old man's lips trembled, and for a second, it seemed he might say more. But then he shook his head and started to walk past Sundar, back toward the street. Sundar reached out, grabbing lightly at his sleeve. "Wait," he said. "Who are they? What are you supposed to do?" The old man stopped. His shoulders rose and fell with a shaky breath. But he didn't turn around this time. Instead, he muttered, "If you follow me, you'll find out. But don't say I didn't warn you." Then he pulled free, disappeared into the dark. Sundar stood there, alone now, the rain falling harder, soaking his jacket. His hands shook, though he didn't know if it was from the cold or from something else, a creeping sense of dread and curiosity. He couldn't shake Dot. He could still hear the old man's words in his head, like an echo. If you follow me, you'll find out, but don't say I didn't warn you. He stared into the shadows where the old man had vanished. Something inside him, something deeper than reason, pushed him to move forward, to follow, to see this through. And just as he took a step deeper into the alley, a faint glint of metal caught his eye. Lying on the ground near where the old man had stood was a small silver key, almost hidden in a crack between the stones. Sundar bent down and picked it up. It felt cold and heavy in his palm, and there was something engraved on it, a single word he could barely make out in the dim light. He held it closer and squinted. The word read, "Mercy." He stared at the key, feeling a strange chill crawl down his spine. Somewhere far ahead, in the maze of alleys, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly, and with the key tight in his hand, Sundar followed. Asterisk. The door beneath the city, sound of Sundar's footsteps echoed against the narrow walls as he moved deeper into the back alleys of the city. The silver key in his hand felt colder now, as if it had soaked up the chill in the air. The word, "Mercy," engraved into it kept catching the weak reflections from the scattered streetlights, like it was trying to remind him of something he didn't yet understand. The rain had slowed to a whisper, but the water still dripped steadily from the rooftops above. Every few feet, Sundar paused to listen, unsure if the faint sounds behind him were simply the wind, or someone following. He should have gone home. He knew that. He had no reason to follow the old man, no logical reason anyway, but something inside him, something quiet but firm, told him this was important. Not for the company, not for any reward, but for something human, something that mattered in ways spreadsheets never could. After a few turns, the alley opened into a small courtyard hidden between old apartment buildings. There were broken crates stacked near a metal door with peeling green paint, rust dripping from its hinges like old blood. Sundar might have passed it if not for a symbol just above the doorframe. The same word as the key, "Mercy," scratched faintly into the wood. He stepped closer, heart thudding, and tried the key. It slid in smoothly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open with a groan that echoed like a warning inside. The air was damp and still. The faint smell of old paper and mildew clung to the darkness. He stepped through and found himself in a narrow staircase leading downward. Steep, uneven, and dimly lit by flickering lights fixed into the stone walls. Each step down felt like moving back in time. The sounds of the city faded behind him. The air grew heavier. He reached the bottom and found a long hallway made of concrete and metal, filled with locked doors on either side. It felt like a place forgotten by the world, or deliberately hidden. He walked slowly, listening for any sound, any voice. Halfway down the hall, he passed a door with deep scratches near the handle. Something about it made him shiver, but he kept going until he reached the door at the far end. Unlike the others, it was clean. There was no lock, only a small plaque with the number 13 and a faded name that had been scratched off. Sundar pushed the door open. The room inside was small and bare, lit by a single overhead light that buzzed quietly. Against the far wall sat a wooden table and 2 chairs. On the table was a thick file folder tied with string and a small tape recorder. But what drew Sundar's attention most was the photo resting on top of the folder. He stepped closer and froze. It was a photo of him, recent, taken just a few days ago, walking out of the Google campus, holding a coffee in one hand, his phone in the other. He stared at it, heart racing. Beneath the photo was a short line written in red ink. Observe, test, report, do not engage. Sundar single, quotes went from his mouth, went dry. His mind raced to make sense of it. Who had taken this? Why was he being observed? What did test mean? He opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were more photos, each one showing him at different moments, leaving meetings, walking to lunch, driving home. Whoever had taken them had been watching him closely. There were notes too. Short ones like shows restraint, offers help. Without prompt, high curiosity response. Beneath all that was a second folder, thinner. Sundar opened it slowly and found a different set of photos. This time, The subject wasn't him, Dot. It was the old man. The photos showed him sitting alone in different parks, sleeping on benches, talking to strangers. One photo showed him slipping a folded note into a woman's bag. Another showed him walking into a building that looked like a library. But on closer look, Sundar realized it was abandoned. Dot. The notes beside the photos were darker this time. Failed last task, emotional hesitation increasing, may no longer be useful. Sundar stared at that line for a long moment, may no longer be useful. Like the old man was a machine being retired. Like a person could be thrown away once they didn't follow orders fast enough. He sat down at the table, staring at everything. Nothing made sense yet, but the feeling in his chest was unmistakable. Dread. Thick, cold dread. Dot. Just then, the door behind him creaked open. Sundar stood quickly, heart hammering. The old man stepped in, soaked from the rain, his face pale and drawn. He closed the door softly and looked at Sundar without surprise. "I hoped you wouldn't come," he said. Quietly, "What is this?" Sundar asked, his voice shaking. "Why are there photos of me?" "What is this place?" The old man didn't answer right away. He walked slowly to the other chair and sat down, his bones creaking like the chair beneath him. He looked at the folder, then back at Sundar. "This is where it begins," he said. "And where it ends." Sundar stayed silent, waiting. The old man sighed and leaned back. "I used to be like you, curious, kind. I thought small actions could change the world. But then they found me. People who live in the cracks of power, not in governments or companies, but deeper than that. They find people with certain traits, people who care too much, and then they turn that against you." Sundar frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man looked down at his hands. "They put me through trials, tests, they called them. I thought I was helping, but then the tests got darker. They made me choose who to save, who to hurt. I told myself it was for the greater good, but the truth is I was just doing their work, breaking myself piece by piece." He looked up again. "And now they're watching you." The room felt colder. Sundar sat down slowly. "Why me?" "Because you hesitated," the old man said. "You stopped. You paid for a stranger's groceries. You looked twice. They saw that, and they marked you." Sundar shook his head. "But why? What do they want from me?" The old man's eyes were tired, but sharp. "They want to see what happens when you're pushed. When the world feels wrong and no one gives you answers, they'll test your patience, your empathy, your silence. And then one day, they'll ask you to make a choice that breaks you." Sundar's voice dropped to a whisper. "And what happens if I say no?" The old man looked away. "They don't like no." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The light above them flickered. Finally, Sundar said, "You want out, don't you?" The old man smiled faintly. "I wanted out the first day I got in, but there's no door." Sundar. "Only deeper rooms." Sundar looked at the folder again. "His own face staring back at him. He closed it slowly. "Then maybe," he said softly, "we have to make a door." The old man's eyes met his. Something flickered in them. Hope, maybe, or fear. Maybe both. But before either of them could speak, again, there was a sharp knock on the door. 3 short knocks. Then silence. The old man stood quickly, eyes wide. "They're not supposed to come here. Not this soon." Sundar stood too. "What do we do?" The old man opened a drawer beneath the table and pulled out a small envelope, black, like the one from before. He shoved it into Sundar's hand. "You want answers?" he whispered. "Then follow what's in this. But be careful. Once you open it, you can't go back." The knocking came again, louder this time. The old man pointed to a narrow vent at the back of the room. "Go now." Sundar hesitated, but then he slipped through the vent just as the door burst open behind him. He didn't look back. And as he crawled through the cold, narrow passage, the envelope pressed to his chest, he knew whatever this was he was in. And now, there would be no going back. Asterisk, the black envelope was cold and narrow, and every movement scraped Sundar's shoulders against metal. The sound of boots thudding into the room behind him still echoed in his ears, and his chest tightened each time he thought he heard voices following him into the dark. But no one came. He kept crawling, the black envelope clutched tightly in. One hand, its corners dug into his palm, sharp and unyielding, after what felt like forever. The vent opened into a quiet alley, hidden between two crumbling buildings. He climbed out, his clothes damp and streaked with dust. The air outside smelled faintly of oil and rain, but it was better than the suffocating darkness he'd left behind. He crouched there for a moment, catching his breath, the envelope resting. On his knee, he stared at it. The paper was thick, almost waxy, sealed with a faint silver mark that looked like a circle cut by a single slash. His fingers hovered over the seal. The old man's words still rang in his head. Once you open it, you can't go back. But going back no longer felt like an option. He broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. When he opened it, his hands shook, not just from the cold. Written in neat black ink was a list of 5 addresses. No names, no explanations. Just 5 places written in perfect, sharp letters. At the bottom of the page was a single line, deliver mercy. Decide who deserves it, Sundar read. It again and again, but it made no more sense the 5th time than it had the first. Yet, as he stood there, staring at the list, he felt a strange pull, as though each address on the page was a stone tied to him, and he could feel the weight of all 5 dragging him forward. He slipped the paper back into the envelope, tucked it into his jacket, and began walking toward the first address. The city looked different now. The streetlights cast longer shadows. Every passerby seemed to glance at him just a second too long. Every sound, a distant siren, the hiss of tires. On wet pavement seemed louder, sharper. He told himself he was imagining it. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. Asterisk. The first address led him to a quiet neighborhood on the far edge of town, where the houses were old but neat, lined up like soldiers beneath the faint glow of the moon. He stopped in front of number 74, a small 2-story home with chipped paint and flowers drooping in cracked pots by the steps. The curtains were drawn. No lights inside. Sundar hesitated at the gate, heart pounding. He thought of turning around. Then he saw the faintest movement behind the window, a shadow shifting just enough to let him know he'd been seen. Opened the gate and walked up the steps. His knuckles hovered over the door for a long moment before he finally knocked. The door opened almost at once. A woman stood there, maybe in her late 40s, wearing a faded sweater and with tired eyes that seemed to know him already. She didn't smile. She didn't even seem surprised. Instead, she stepped aside and said softly, "You're here. Come in." Sundar swallowed hard and stepped inside. The air smelled of something faintly sweet, like old wood and cinnamon, but it couldn't cover a sharper smell underneath. Something metallic and faintly sour. The woman closed the door behind him and led him to a small living room. There was no sound but the quiet ticking of a clock on the wall. She gestured to a chair. Sundar sat. On the table before him was an envelope, just like the one he had carried, black, sealed with the same silver mark. Next to it was a photograph of a young boy, maybe 12, with dark hair and bright eyes. Written on the back of the photo in that same sharp handwriting were 3 words, "Choose. Deliver mercy." The woman watched him silently, her hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles were white. After a long moment, she said, "He's my son. You don't have to do this. But if you don't, they'll send someone else." Sundar's mouth went dry. "What happens if I walk away?" Her eyes hardened, though her voice stayed soft. "Someone pays either way." He stared at the photograph. His own reflection looked back at him faintly from the glass of the frame, and he felt a deep ache in his chest. He thought of the old man, of the things he'd said about being tested, about having no way out. He slid the envelope on the table toward her. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said quietly. Her eyes flickered. "Then why did you come?" Sundar opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, there was a sudden knock at the door. Sharp, deliberate, 3 times. Just like Before the woman froze, she turned her head slowly toward the door. Her hands began to tremble. "They're here," she whispered. Sundar stood quickly. "Who?" She shook her head. "If you don't finish what you started, they finish it for you." The knock came again, louder this time. Sundar grabbed the black envelope from the table and stuffed it into his jacket. He moved toward the back of the house, the woman following close behind. She opened a narrow door that led to a small yard overgrown with weeds. "Go," she said, her voice low but urgent. "Don't let them catch you here." Sundar hesitated at the threshold. "What about you?" She didn't answer. She simply closed the door behind him. He crouched low, moving through the yard and slipping into the alley beyond. He didn't stop until he reached the next street over, his breath clouding in the cold air, his pulse hammering in his ears. He leaned against the wall and pulled out the photograph again. The boy's eyes stared back at him, innocent and unknowing. Sundar closed his eyes, gripping the photo tightly, then tucked it away. Then he pulled out the original list. 4 addresses remained. He stared at the second address for a long time before he began walking again. But as he turned the corner, he froze. There, leaning casually against the lamppost, was the figure in the dark coat, the same one who had given the old man the first envelope. His face was still hidden beneath the scarf. His posture was calm, but his eyes glinted coldly from the shadows. "You're moving faster than expected," the man said, his voice smooth and sharp. "But still, too slow." Sundar swallowed, trying to steady his voice. "What do you want from me?" The man tilted his head slightly, like a predator deciding how much longer to play with its prey. "I want you," he said quietly, "to stop pretending you don't understand what this is." You opened the envelope. You took the key. You followed the path. He pushed himself away from the lamppost and began walking toward Sundar. "You think this is about choice?" The man continued. "There's no choice. There never was. You were chosen before you ever noticed the cracks in your perfect little world." Sundar stood his ground, though every muscle in his body screamed to run. "Then tell me," he said through clenched teeth, "what happens at the end?" The man stopped a few feet away. His eyes glimmered under the streetlight, and for the first time a faint smile tugged at his mouth. "At the end," he said softly, "you learn who you really are." He reached into his coat and pulled out another black envelope. He held it out to Sundar, his gloved fingers steady. "Deliver mercy," he said. Sundar stared at the envelope, then at the man. "And if I refuse?" The smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then someone else delivers it." "To you?" The man dropped the envelope at Sundar's feet and turned away, disappearing into the fog before Sundar could say another word. Sundar stood there in the quiet street, the envelope on the ground between his shoes. He bent slowly and picked it up, feeling the weight of it settle in his hand, and somewhere deep inside, he began to wonder if the old man had been right all along, that no one really ever gets out. He unfolded the note inside, and as he read the next address on the list, he felt a strange, heavy calm settle over him. But just then, from the dark, behind him, a new voice whispered, "You're not alone in this." He spun around, but the street was empty. Asterisk, the unseen ally, the whisper still hung in the air as Sundar turned. But the street was empty. The fog clung to the pavement, swirling faintly around his shoes. His eyes darted to every shadow, every alley, every doorway, but there was no one. Just silence and the faint hum of a distant street lamp above him. He stood frozen, clutching the black envelope in his hand, his breath sharp in the cold air. The voice, it had sounded close, impossibly close, as though it had been spoken directly into his ear, but when he called out softly, "Who's there?" the fog only swallowed his words. He backed against a brick wall, feeling its rough surface dig into his shoulders, and tried to calm his racing thoughts. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe the pressure, the fear, the weight of what he'd seen so far. Maybe it was all making him hear things dot, but then he noticed something strange. Beneath the fog at his feet, someone had written a single word on the ground, traced faintly in white chalk. It hadn't been there before. He was sure of it. It read, Rooftop dot, he stared at it, his chest tightening. Before slowly lifting his gaze to the nearest fire escape, the metal ladder clung to the side of the building, slick with rain and rusted at the edges. Still, something about that word, the quiet insistence of it, pushed him forward. He reached up, gripped the ladder, and began to climb. The city felt quieter the higher he went, as though the noises of the streets below were part of another world. By the time he reached the roof, the fog had thinned, and the air was sharper. Clearer, he hoisted himself over the ledge, breathing hard, his palms raw from the climb dot at first. He thought he was alone, but then he saw her. She stood near the edge of the roof, her figure outlined against the dim orange glow of the city lights below. She wore a long coat, the collar turned up to shield her face, and a scarf that shifted faintly in the wind. She didn't turn when he stepped closer, but she spoke, and the calm strength of her voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have opened the second envelope," she said. Sundar froze, every muscle tense. "Who are you?" he asked finally, his voice low. She turned then, just enough for him to see her eyes, clear, steady, and something else too, something broken and hard-won. "Someone who opened hers a long time ago," she replied. They stood there for a long beat, the night pressing in around them. Finally, Sundar moved closer, though not too close. "You whispered to me," he said. "You left the chalk." She nodded faintly. "You're not the first. They pick people like you, people who believe kindness is a strength instead of a weakness. People who hesitate." He swallowed. And then they break you," she said simply. The words sank into him like stones. He looked down at the envelope in his hand, its seal still unbroken, and felt its weight grow heavier. "What's in it?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "Another test, another person, another choice that isn't really a choice." He clenched his fist around the envelope. "Why me?" Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because you noticed," she said. "Most people never even see the old man. They walk past. You stopped. You helped. You watched. That's all it takes." He shook his head, frustration rising in his chest. "But what do they want?" "What is this? Who are they?" Her gaze hardened then, and for the first time he saw anger flicker beneath her calm exterior. "They're what's left when everything else rots away. Not a company, not a government, just hunger. They feed on people like you. They test how much good a person can carry before it turns to something else." She stepped closer now, her voice dropping lower. "But you don't have to play by their rules. That's what they don't tell you." His breath caught. "What do you mean?" She reached into her coat and pulled out a small object. Another key, this one gold, engraved with a different word. She held it out to him, her hand steady. "You can keep opening their envelopes," she said, "and watch yourself disappear piece by piece. Or you can take this and fight your way out." He stared at the key. The word on it shimmered faintly in the dark. Resolve. He didn't reach for it yet. His mind was a storm of questions. "What happens if I take it?" "You stop playing their game," she said. "You make them afraid of you instead." He hesitated, his fingers trembling above the key. "What happens if I fail?" Her eyes didn't flinch. "Then you disappear," she said. "But at least it's your choice." He thought of the old man, of the woman in the house, of the boy's photograph, of the faces in the file, all quietly waiting for someone to decide their fate. He thought of the list still folded in his pocket, and how much heavier it felt now. Dot finally. He took the gold key. Dot. The woman nodded, the faintest hint of approval in her eyes. "Good," she said. "You're not alone anymore." He looked up at her sharply. "Are there others?" "There are always others," she said softly. "You just have to find them." He opened his mouth to ask how, but before he could speak, her eyes flicked past his shoulder, and her body stiffened. "They found you," she whispered, though his pulse spiked. "What? Go," she said, her voice urgent now. "Use the key. Find the door before they do." "Where?" he demanded. She stepped back into the shadows, her figure already melting into the darkness. "You'll know," she called softly, and then she was gone. Behind him, on the roof's opposite edge, 3 figures in dark coats appeared, moving silently, deliberately, their scarves pulled high over their faces. Sundar didn't wait. He scrambled back to the fire escape, his mind pounding with everything she'd said. He slid down the ladder, landing hard in the alley below, clutching the gold key so tight it dug into his skin. He ran, through narrow streets and twisting alleys, past doors and windows that all blurred into the same dark shapes. But even as he ran, his thoughts kept returning to her words. Find the door. You'll know. And then he saw it. In an unlit side street. Halfway hidden behind a collapsed fence, there was a narrow archway of stone. Faint carvings lined its edges, and at its center was a small keyhole that gleamed faintly gold in the moonlight. He stumbled toward it, breathless, and fit the key into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, grinding sound, the stone door began to swing open. Warm light spilled out into the cold night, and a faint hum, low and strange, like a heartbeat, echoed from the space beyond. He hesitated at the threshold, his heart hammering. Behind him. The faint sound of boots on pavement grew louder, closer. He stepped through the door, and it closed silently behind him. The room of choices door closed behind Sundar, with a sound that felt almost alive. Not a slam, not even loud, but final. Like a sigh from something that had been waiting for him all along. For a moment he stood still, his breath catching in his throat as the warm light washed over him. His eyes adjusted slowly, and he found himself standing in a vast, circular chamber. The walls shimmered faintly, as though made of stone and glass, at once etched with strange symbols that pulsed softly with gold and silver light. Above him the ceiling rose, higher than he could see, fading into darkness. Yet he felt watched, not by a person, but by the room itself. At the center was a table, simple, wooden, almost plain. Yet it seemed heavier than the world around it. On the table were 2 objects, the black envelope he had carried, now lying open and empty, and the gold key, still warm in his hand. Beside them, set into the surface of the table, was a small plaque. 3 words were carved into it, so clean and sharp they seemed new. Mercy or resolve. He stared at the words, then down at the 2 objects. His chest tightened as he thought of everything that had led him here. The old man at the grocery store, the alley, the photographs, the woman on the roof. All those moments that had felt like accidents, but now seemed carefully stitched into this single choice. Behind him came the faintest sound. A footstep. He turned quickly. The woman from the roof was there again, though this time her scarf was gone. Her face was calm, but her eyes held something heavy, something that told him she had stood here once too. "This is it," she said, softly. "The end." "And the beginning," he swallowed. "What happens if I choose mercy?" She walked closer, the faint light catching. In her hair. "You become like him," she said, "the old man, carrying out their orders, delivering their tests, hurting quietly so others don't have to. You fade into the cracks of the world, and no one ever remembers you." He looked down at the black envelope, feeling its weight even now, though it was empty. "And if I choose resolve?" he asked. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Then you fight them," she said. "You tear yourself free. But it won't be easy. It won't be clean. You won't be the same." He looked at her then, searching her face for something, anger, hope, regret. But all he saw was a kind of resigned understanding. "Which did you choose?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze. "I chose resolve," she said. "And I've been fighting ever since." He turned back to the table, his fingers grazing the edge of the envelope, then the key. Both seemed to hum faintly under his touch, as though they recognized him. "Why me?" he asked softly, the question spilling out almost without thought. The woman stood behind him, her voice low. "Because you're the kind of man who notices," she said. "The kind who stops. The kind who still believes it matters." His hands shook. He thought of the boy's photograph, of the woman clutching her hands so tightly her knuckles turned white, of the old man's tired eyes as he whispered, "You shouldn't be here." He thought of how far he had come, of all the doors he had passed through, each one pulling him closer to this moment. He closed his eyes, and then he reached for the gold key, the moment his fingers closed around it. The room seemed to exhale. The light grew brighter, the walls began to pulse faster, and deep vibration rose from the floor, rattling his bones. The woman didn't move, but her eyes softened just slightly, as though she had been waiting to see if he was strong enough. "Then it begins," she said simply. Before he could speak, the ground beneath him shifted, not violently but decisively, and a narrow path opened where there had been none. It led toward a dark archway, faintly glowing at its edges. As though promising something he couldn't yet name, he turned to the woman one last time. "What's through there?" he asked. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "The rest of your story," she said, "and theirs." He hesitated at the threshold, the key burning faintly in his palm. And then he stepped through. The light swallowed him whole, and suddenly he was standing not in a room, but in a quiet park at dawn. Birds chirped softly in the trees above, and the air was crisp and clean, carrying the smell of earth and grass. Everything seemed normal, ordinary, but then he noticed them, shadows moving between the trees, men in dark coats, women with calm, tired eyes, children watching silently from swings, all of them turning, very slowly, to look at him as he stood there. And as they watched, he felt it, a strange, deep certainty rising inside him. The weight of the key in his hand, the memory of the old man, the sound of the woman's voice, the word resolve echoing in his chest like a heartbeat. One of the figures stepped forward. The man in the dark coat, his scarf now lowered, his sharp eyes locked on Sundar's. He stopped a few feet away, studying him for a long moment. Then, to Sundar's surprise, he nodded faintly. "So you chose," the man said. His voice was low, but there was a trace of something new in it. Respect, maybe, or fear. Sundar didn't speak. He simply tightened his grip on the key, and as the figures began to close in, forming a loose circle around him, he understood this wasn't the end of the test. It was the beginning of the fight. He stood taller, shoulders square, heart steady, and in that quiet park, as the sun began to rise, Sundar took his first step forward. The shadows shifted. The figures moved, and the world held its breath. Asterisk.